was developed several years ago after the TMDL was established as part of figuring out how to develop watershed implementation plans. And so CAST has been around for a while. We have this Chesapeake Bay TMDL that was established in 2010, and all of the implementation is due to achieve the load reduction is due to be done by 2025. So we're now at the midpoint, and as part of this midpoint, there's an assessment going on, and that means that we're redoing the models, and that has given us an opportunity to update CAST so that it is consistent with the new model and to add in some more functionality. I should just say that this is a Chesapeake Bay program product, and there is a long history going way back before the TMDL of states figuring out what the plan is for reducing nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment loads. So this really online tool came about because of the TMDL, but the history of developing plans goes way, way back. So what we have here is the home page, and you don't even have to log in. I'm not logged in right now, and there's a lot of information here that's available. And this is a way to kind of pull together information for people. We have the data used for making sure that this version of the model from the midpoint assessment is reflecting what the partnership wanted. We have information about transitioning from the old version. We have data like this, the source data that people from, say, Long Island Sound use, as well as people in the Chesapeake Bay. And I'll show you more as we get into scenarios. And then we have other information available. A lot of the mapping and GIS products are available on this page. And so there's a lot of other information. And we have costs as well on optimization, as well as the co-benefits, like you know, the impact of BMPs on black duck habitat, for example. So that sort of information is under optimization. So this is meant to be a place that people can come and get some general information. I showed you before the public reports that people use, and you don't have to log in. We have, you know, how-to information and just general information. And then the contact us, which shoots an email to us so we can respond to questions. Questions are everything from, I can't figure out where to click to get something. I know it's there, it must be, but I can't find it, to how do I separate base flow from surface flow, groundwater from surface water. So you get into, you know, some nitty-gritty modeling technical questions to just kind of how to use the tool, or where do I find, you know, sorts of questions. So those are all good questions to submit, and people should, you know, feel free to do so. To log in, we now have FSMA compliance, so you have to register, and you shoot you an email, and then you can go ahead and log in with the information from your email. I have already created my login. When you log in, you will see this page, which is your scenarios. And on the scenarios, you have my scenarios. When you first log in, you won't have any. I've created a whole bunch, but you won't have any under my scenarios. Those are ones that you create specifically. And then you have a list of shared scenarios. I want to make my page look like whatever yours would look like, and that means that you probably wouldn't have anybody sharing anything with you except for CBP, Chesapeake Bay Program Admin. And this is a list of all of the annual scenarios starting with 1984. If I scroll to the very bottom, you can see we start at 1984. And that's the beginning of the period that we look at for BMPs that were submitted. So if you look at 1984, there weren't that many BMPs that we have recorded as being in place. There's, for agriculture, there's things like conservation tillage, but you're not going to see, you'll see a little bit of that, you'll see a little bit of a few other things, but you won't see too many urban BMPs, for example. And then as you go through the years, there's more and more submitted. Because we are in the midst of developing this new version of the model with a midpoint assessment, we are only going through 2013. In a couple of weeks, we will have through 2016. And then in February is when we complete the 2017 data. And I say February, it could be March, it depends. It's usually February, March, depending on the states. And so then we'll have the 2017. We also have some other scenarios here. We have our no action, which is on 2010 conditions. That was the year of the TMDL. And we also have what we call our Everything, Everywhere by Everyone, or E3, which is how you'll hear me refer to it. And this is a draft version. There's a partnership approval process, and this is not the final version that's been approved. And then we have the Phase 2 WIP, or Watershed Implementation Plan. And this was what was created in, I think it was 2011, maybe it leaked a little into 2012, I'm not sure, for the second version of the state's watershed implementation plans. And those are developed by the states with input from local government. And each state did it a little bit differently in Phase 2. They will also be doing it differently among states in Phase 3, but this is, one of the big goals of this tool is to make that WIP development easier for the states and for local governments to participate. And in addition to local governments, also to get input and feedback from water keepers and other NGOs that are interested in how these environmental plans are being developed. So this is very much a planning tool. We put these historical scenarios in there because it's good to have a point of comparison and to ask yourself what-if questions. What if the state did this set of BMPs instead of that BMPs? But it's very much a planning tool and not a reporting tool. And I say that mostly for the benefit of the Great Lakes folks, because the states do report the data, and we do put that data in here, but they are not submitting that reported data directly to CAST. And the reason is that the Bay program determined through its work groups that the actual implementation that was put in place, that reported data, had to have a lot more information associated with it. In some cases, you need a latitude and a longitude. You need a date it was inspected. You need all kinds of information that you really don't need in a plan. For a plan, you would never put an inspection date in there because you're just saying we're going to implement it. You wouldn't need the exact lat and long. You just need to say generally it's going to go in this particular segment or area or watershed. And so for a planning tool, we keep it a little bit more general. So we do carry over this information that was submitted for reporting and that is also verified, but we don't carry over all of the detail, and that information is not submitted directly to CAST. CAST really is only a planning tool. So whenever you're doing a plan or asking yourself a what-if question, then you would want to have a comparison. If we did X versus Y, what is the difference? So you always want to have more than one scenario to compare to. So it may be that you're going to use one of these shared scenarios to compare to, in which case that's fine, but you still need to create the one that you want to compare. Let's start off by doing a comparison with the WIP2. Let's say if we're doing a WIP2, the WIP2 is here. What if we were to do something different this time around? So what I'm going to do is add a new scenario. And I'm just going to walk through the steps and make these selections. And as I make these selections, I'll tell you kind of what the thought process is and some of the options that are available. Now I'm going to get started on this, but let me pause here and see if you'll have any questions on anything I've talked about so far. Okay, so I'm going to just call this comparison to WIP2, and I'll just say this is a potential plan for WIP3. And then there are BMPs available. We have two options. Those that are approved for reporting purposes, and those are called official, or those that are a little more fuzzy in the sense that they haven't been well researched and are not through the formal approval process, and we call those planning BMPs. You can use planning BMPs in any plan, obviously, but if you wanted to restrict it, you could change it just to official. In any of these selections that I'm making now, you can come back and change later. So if you make a selection and then run a scenario and decide, oops, I really meant to do something different, then that's okay. You can come back and make a change. I'm hovering over this question mark. You can see that there are question marks throughout that you can hover over and get more information. For geographic scale, we have a lot of different options. Sometimes people want to look at the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed, no detail, and they don't care too much about the details. They just want to say for the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed, what if cover crops were implemented at 70%? What impact would that have? And that's a good question to ask, and that's an option to do it that way. More often than not, people are doing a plan at a smaller scale, and they're looking at county, or they're looking at a HUC, hydrologic unit code, and 12 would be the smallest that we have. For those HUCs, we divide them into the area that's in the state, and also they will automatically be in the Chesapeake Bay watershed because the watershed is obviously a drainage area. And then we also have some other options in here. One is major basin, and so that would be, an example would be the Susquehanna or the Potomac or the James or the Eastern Shore. Those are major basins. And then you could have a state basin. So the Potomac spans 5 different states, and I'm kind of classifying D.C. as a state here, but 5 different jurisdictions. And it may be that you want the Potomac, and you could do this, and you can see that we've got all of these, and maybe you only want the Maryland portion or the Maryland and West Virginia portion, or you could, select all of those, and that's fine too. I'll go ahead and select just the Maryland Potomac River Basin. Oops, I moved all of those over. Let me just double click on that one. And now it's just the Maryland Potomac. And then we can select our base condition. This is the year of the plan. So what we normally do for WIPs is we look at it on 2010 because that was the year the TMDL was established. Kind of an interesting thing is that Monday and Tuesday there's a meeting to determine if it should remain 2010 or we should look at a different year. A lot of times when you're doing a plan, you're comparing to the most recent year of data. And like I said, we only have up to 2013 now, but in a couple of weeks we'll have through 2016. And so you might want to pick the most recent year as your base condition. When you're picking your base condition, you're going to want to make sure that whatever you're comparing to, if you're comparing it to a WIP, you want to pick the same year that that WIP is on. If you're comparing it to a 2013, annual progress, then you might want to pick 2013, just so you're comparing apples to apples. And then selecting wastewater data. I meant to select WIP on that. So there's several options in here. There's E3, no action, and then the various years. And then there's a cost profile. We do provide cost data, and we have it for each state. There's also one for the whole Chesapeake Bay watershed. There's also cost profiles that you can create, and I created one called Virginia High, and I just increased the cost for the BMPs in Virginia to come up with a kind of a maximum cost for that one. Since we're doing Maryland, I'll pick Maryland, and I can come back later and change this if I want to create my own cost profile later and change what's associated with this scenario. I can do that. And then I always encourage collaboration, and so you can collaborate by selecting other users in here to share your scenario with, and you can always do a search to come up with a name, and you could add that name, for example, to share your scenario with. And I'll go back, and I won't share right now. Usually what I do when I'm creating scenarios is I create a whole bunch and figure out which one I like, and then I go back and I share it with the person I'm working with. And then you can copy BMPs, and there are a couple of ways to do it: by uploading a file, and we can go through that, but also by doing an existing scenario. I'm going to select an existing scenario right now. Let me show you what these 3 options are. You can just pick a scenario, and since my comparison is going to be the WIP, I'm going to want to copy in those WIP BMPs, and then I'm going to change them or add to them. So if I want to do that, I can copy in from the WIP. And it's a long list, so I'm just going to type WI, and then up comes the WIP. The other option is to do it by sector. So perhaps, Joe did agriculture, in which case I would go and select whatever agriculture scenario he might have shared with me. And maybe someone else did a developed scenario, and I want to copy in whatever they did for the developed if they had created a specific one. So you can collaborate that way by being somebody who's a specialist in ag work with someone who's a specialist in the developed or urban sector. And then the other option is to do what state, if you're doing like the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed. I don't anticipate very many people using this outside of the staff at the Chesapeake Bay program who might want to pull scenarios together from multiple states, but it is an option. Let's go back to single, because I think this is what most people are going to use. So now I've made my selections. I've named my scenario. I put in a description. I've selected BMPs and a geography, and I could add notes here, just whatever I want, but it's not required. And I can go ahead and click Save. So what's happening now is that scenario is editing. All those BMPs are getting copied in. So this is my scenario, and I own it. It is no longer going to be classified as the official WIP, and it's not. I didn't share it with anybody. It is just my own scenario. So this is going to make sure all those BMPs validate. Let me pause here and see if anyone has any questions about adding a scenario. Okay.
Will after they decide on after the partnership decides on the base year, will that stay as an option, or will it be selected to whatever they decide?
You will always have the years 1984, and well, we don't have them all in here yet because we don't have all the final data yet. So you will always have the years 1984 through 2025. So even if the partnership decides that the base year is going to be for the WIP will be 2010, you can still do a scenario on 2013, 2017, 2025, whatever you want.
And just to follow up to that, is there a reason that would be beneficial that you can think of? Or I'm just kind of trying to imagine a situation where you would do that.
Where you would put it on 2010?
Where you would change it from what the partnership decision would be.
Well, people use CAST for all kinds of reasons, not just for the WIP. So if you were doing a WIP, you would probably want to always do it on whatever the partnership decides. But if you're working on a local TMDL, you might want to do it on the year that the TMDL was established. Or alternatively, you could account for growth, like, more developed land, in which case you could say the TMDL, a local TMDL, for example, on just a small watershed was meant to be achieved in 2019, then you might want to pick 2019. Another way people use the tool is to just say, what if we were to do something different this year or next year, in which case you might want to pick just this year or next year's year. So it depends on why you're creating scenarios. People sometimes use it for 319 money to do a plan for 319, in which case that's an EPA grant program, in which case you're going to do something different than that TMDL, whatever the WIP year is. And if you want to account for growth and you're associating this with the Bay TMDL, you might want to pick 2025 because it will have those growth projections in there. When I'm talking about growth, I'm talking about change in land use. So we generally think of that as more developed acres and less agricultural and forested acres. So does that answer your question? Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and edit this, and what pops up is the selections I already made, and I could change them, but I just made them and I feel pretty confident. It's always good to check the invalid BMPs. Note that there are 3 tabs here. Some people don't see all 3. There's land, and then there's animal and manure transport. I didn't have any invalid BMPs. You wouldn't if you're copying BMPs from an existing scenario, but if you're uploading BMPs, you might. And we'll come back to that at the end of the webinar. But it's just important to check, especially when you upload BMPs. Let's go to the Develop BMP page. You can see we've got tabs here for all of the different types of BMPs. Each of these pages looks about the same, but let me take a minute to go through this. We have agency type. This is new in this version of the model, so those of y'all who have used it before will kind of scratch your head and say, what is this? This is agency type is because the federal agencies needed a way to look at their specific acres in each segment. And so this is what we are seeing here. And I just expanded Department of Defense for these developed acres. So it's not all of Department of Defense in the Potomac, Maryland section. It's just in the developed, and we have here acres, the units up here at the top. So most of that is in turf grass, non-regulated turf grass. If you look at agriculture, the federal agencies were not attributed with any agriculture that is agriculture, but ARS has non-agricultural land, so they will end up with some acres in here for the developed sector. So that's it for federal. Most people are a little more interested in non-federal. In Maryland, whenever you do a scenario in Maryland, you're going to see these two categories that show up. These don't show up in any other state. Maryland State is a category, and these are categories that MDE created. Maryland State represents land that is owned by the state, and my best example would be like Baltimore Washington International Airport. So that airport land is owned by the state. So that's classified in here. And we have a lot of regulated turf grass and tree canopy over turf grass and buildings in here. And then we also have this State Highway Administration, and they generally do their own plan and submit it to MDE, who then collapses it into a statewide plan. So they have their own category here. And then non-federal is everything else. And this is useful to see what the acres are for all of these different load sources. These load sources are ones that the partnership agreed to use. These didn't come from anything except decisions that work groups made. So you could classify the land use in a lot of different ways, but this is the system that the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership came up with to have it divided into non-regulated MS4 as well as the combined sewer system, which is what CSS is. And so we have those three categories. The CSS is kind of an interesting one because that's measured by, that is a point source essentially. That is measured by what comes out of the end of a pipe in terms of wastewater, because that is a combined sewer system. So if you put BMPs on CSS land, they're not going to really show a reduction because that's coming out of the monitoring data, not out of a plan you would create here. So I kind of take a look at this and it's like, okay, that's interesting. And then when I'm doing plans, I just kind of ignore it because I know that's coming out of monitored data from wastewater, or if it's a plan, it's projected what that would be, and that's just something that you do when you add a scenario, not something you put BMPs on. So you can take a look and see what is the next load source that has the most acres. If you have a load source that has 0 acres, it's obviously something you wouldn't want to target in terms of load reductions. So that just gives you an idea of what's there in terms of acres, and that's here at the top of the screen, and you can download that. You can also get this information under results. There's a report called Base Conditions that puts it together for all of these different sectors. The next part of this screen is the BMP data submitted. And this is all the BMPs that we copied in. So this is from the Phase 2 WIPs, and we copied all of this in when we created our scenario. And you can do all kinds of filtering here, and you could pick ponds, for example. And I just typed pond, and so I think that vegetated open channel will go away, and we'll see the different kinds of ponds that are here. And then you can see that you can also filter by agency. So maybe I want to look just at Defense, Department of Defense. And so I did that, and nothing shows up. I don't think that any of the federal, well, I actually know that none of the federal BMPs, none of the BMPs for the WIPs were attributed to federal agencies. So that meant that nothing showed up when I filtered on Defense. Everything in here is going to be non-federal. As you hover over these, the definition for the agency pops up, the definition for the BMP pops up. You can see the geographic area that this was added as. This cryptic code here is the modeling segment name, which is not particularly meaningful. If you do other states or other BMPs, sometimes it will pop up with the name of a huck, so it might say something like Dry River Run, and then it'll have that 12-digit code associated with it, with that huck, or it could pop up with the name of the county. It could say Anne Arundel County, Maryland. So the geographic area is whatever that BMP was put on. And in this case, it was put on that cryptic land river segment or modeling segment code. And then we have the load source. So this is impervious developed land. This is a broad category encompassing MS4, CSS, and non-regulated, and then all of the different kinds of impervious load sources. And then the amount, and then the unit. The unit is not the same for all the BMPs. Generally, it's acres not for agriculture, and generally it's acres treated for developed BMPs, but it does depend. If you do something like stream restoration, it's going to be measured in length, like feet. So we could go in here and say that we want to edit this BMP and increase the amount of implementation, and that is one option. But since this was input, this way, we may want to say, well, what about for the entire Potomac? We may not want to just, edit that, because then we'd have to go into each of these rows, and that wouldn't necessarily make sense. So we might want to go in and do Add BMP, and we can just select. We could select a county, and again, it'll be a county within the Maryland Potomac, or we could pick the state basin, in which case the only option here is Maryland, because that's all we put in our scenario. But if we had done Maryland and West Virginia, this drop-down would also have West Virginia in there. And then we need to select our agency. I'm going to select non-federal. And then we need to select our BMP. And there are a lot of BMPs in here. And you can certainly read the definitions. That's an option. In the last webinar, I showed you all how to get the source data and read these all in one place. Something like filtering practices encompasses a lot of different things, and so it might be better represented elsewhere or may not match exactly what you're thinking about. I'll pick a forest buffer. Forest buffers are a really good BMP. Under some of these BMPs, there are secondary BMPs. This one doesn't have any secondary, but if I had gone and picked street sweeping, let's see if I can find street sweeping. Here's street sweeping. Then the secondary BMP, you can see there are a lot of different options here. There's the mechanical broom, once a week, once a month, once a week, every week, or twice a week, or we have the advanced street sweeping technology. So there are a lot of different options under secondary BMPs. And you'll see that on all of these. You'll see a primary one and a secondary one. I'm going to go back to the forest buffers and then select the load source. So I don't want to put on CSS. I already know that that one's not going to show up as a reduction. I could put it just on MS4 land, and a lot of times people are doing a plan just for an MS4. So if you're doing an MS4 plan and you want to submit your plan to a state agency, then with the load reductions and the BMPs, then you can download those tables out of CAST and submit that. And if it's just for an MS4, you want to select MS4. You could pick just the non-regulated portion, or you could just say you want to do turf grass, and it would take all of those three options all together and spread it out proportionally. And that's the most general option. And then we have the option to enter the BMP in units of acres in buffers or the percent. So some of those I showed you were acres treated. This one is acres in buffers, but I'm going to enter it in percent. So let's say that we're going to put forest buffers on 3% of the land. Now, think about this mathematically. How do you calculate a percent if somebody already has in this table down below, already has this in terms of acres? It's probably going to tell me that it did tell me quickly that it overlaps. So we couldn't figure out how to mathematically calculate a percent as well as in acres. You'd have to pick one to do first. So when it's already in that table, you probably need to avoid the percent. So I'm going to say 3 acres in buffers. Probably should have changed that to something higher, but nonetheless, I'm adding my 3 acres of forest buffers in the Maryland Potomac. So I could take a look and say, well, I'm increasing the buffers, and let me see what those load differences are. Does anybody have any questions on how to add a BMP? Okay. So I showed you that you can edit just by going to line and editing, and you can also you can do that, and you can also go in here and add it using the blue button. I have this filtered to pond. I want to clear that so I can see my buffer that I just added. So here's the buffer I just added, and I put 3. I'm going to put 300 to get 300 acres in there. Something a little more substantial since we're talking about a pretty big area. And you'll also notice that we have cost over here. This is the total annualized cost per unit. When you calculate your entire scenario, you're going to see the cost, the total cost for all 300 acres. So now it's cost per 100, I'm sorry, it's cost per 1 acre in buffer is $91. So 300 times 91 is what that total cost will be. But it's not, we haven't run the scenario, so we don't have all that information yet, but you will when you run the scenario and get your results. So I've gone over how to edit the BMP, how to add the BMP. You could also make changes in bulk by downloading this information and then changing it in a file and then uploading it. And we can get to that if you'd like. Let me switch over to some of these other options. Before I do, are there people on the line who are interested in agriculture? Sometimes I do webinars and it turns out no one was interested in agriculture. They were only interested in the developed lands. So before I show you anything with ag, I want to check.
This is Ezra Penfuser up in Pennsylvania. Agriculture would be good for me. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, great. I just want to make sure before I do that. We have septic systems. So take a look at the unit. It's the number of systems, and here it's the number of septic systems. For whatever reason, there was a determination that septic systems would all be declared as non-federal, although I realize that there are some federal septic systems. This was a decision that was made, so you can see the septic systems. And then the BMPs are here that you can connect to a wastewater treatment system. You can do pumping, and you can do septic denitrification. The one that comes up a lot is pumping, because a lot of jurisdictions have regulations that you have to pump something like every 3 years, and I know the details vary, but it's going to be something like that. These scenarios are all annual scenarios. They represent the BMPs that are in place in that 1 year. So if you pump, let's say everybody has to pump every 3 years, you're not going to want to put in 100% of pumping. You'd probably put in something like 33% of pumping, and that is the assumption that it's an equal number of pumping every year. But that would be, a way to handle that. And it also gave me an excuse to talk about the fact that this is a scenario that's done for just 1 year. So that's the septic systems. We have natural BMPs, natural lands. Let me show you what those look like. We have still and combined sewer system mixed open. Mixed open pretty much represents that which could not be mapped as anything else. And it is, those open land that was not known to be agricultural pasture or hay, and was not known to be anything else. So it gets mapped as mixed open. The mixed open here is going to be it has to be bigger than a few acres. We also have forest harvest. We also have harvested forest and true forest, and we have 2 kinds of wetlands, and we have water. water in this version of the model is water that's a pretty small stream. It is perennial, stream, so it has to always be there, but it is a much smaller stream than what we had in the previous version of the model. And if you do an analysis over a time period where you're looking at a comparison of 2010 to 2011 and 2012, for example, you will see the acres of water changing, and that has to do with the change in streams and the change in ponds that exist in the watershed. So water does change, and the remote sensing data confirms that. We have two types of streams. We have bed and bank and floodplain. I believe a decision is being made. I'm not sure where it is in the process of the final decision. I don't think it's final, but of getting rid of one of these because it didn't work quite right with the way people expected for the people who worked on the streams. So I think we're just going to end up with stream bed and bank, and stream floodplain would be represented a different way. But for this draft version, we do have both in here. And then we have shoreline. So if you were in New York or West Virginia, you would have no shoreline acres. This is shoreline of the Chesapeake Bay, so where it becomes tidal. So you would have no shoreline in some states, in some regions. Notice that most of these are measured in acres, but there's also miles up here. And if you look at miles, then we do have these streams and shoreline measured in miles for that category. And here we've got the BMPs, and adding a BMP works just the same way. Let's take a quick look at what the BMP options are. We have abandoned mine reclamation. You have algal flowways. When you pick this, the load source available will only be shoreline. So, if you were to select that in New York, and it would go on 0 length of shoreline, and you wouldn't get any credit. So, obviously, you wouldn't do that, but just to kind of highlight that the tool will figure this out and see if it works, and it won't do it if it doesn't work. Forest harvesting practices, oyster aquaculture, again, that's only on certain load sources. That's going to only be on the shoreline. And again, there are a lot of different kinds of oyster aquaculture, so you can take some options from there. If you pick site-specific, then the units change. And this is true of other BMPs, that generally you have all of these categories of the load source amount and unit, but certain BMPs there will be additional categories of what to add. So this is saying it's site-specific, and you would need to enter the monitored pounds of nitrogen and monitored pounds of phosphorus that are removed. And then there's shoreline management, stream restoration, and wetland enhancement and rehabilitation. So I picked wetland rehabilitation, and we are back to the more typical list of options here. So I'm going to skip that one. That's an example of a natural. And then let's take a look at the agriculture. So this is federal, and you'll see the total is 0. That's because there are 0 agriculture acres attributed to federal lands. And where they actually have agriculture, because of course they do, like, Beltsville Agricultural Research Service or the National Park Service has quite a bit of land and pasture and other ag. Though that is just not attributed to the federal agencies. Instead, it's attributed to non-federal, and that was a policy decision, certainly not one based on mapping. So we have some options here. You can see there's soybeans, that's full season soybeans. If you're double cropping where you have soybeans and corn in the same year, then that will go under double cropped land. Double cropped land is typically the highest number of acres, because that is what most people do. We have ag open space. That is like mixed open. It is similar to that, in that it is the load source where we don't know exactly what it is. And we attribute that to open space. It is also a load source that does not have any nutrients applied to it. So if it's in a reserve program of some sort, then then it's not going to have any crops on it. It's not going to have any animals grazed on it. It would not have nutrients applied. So when you add BMPs that change the load source, like land retirement, you had it in pasture, it moves it to open space, or you had it in crop, some kind of cropland, it would move it to open space. If you put land retirement. So this is a good load source to have because it is a low loading land load source. Specialty crop high and low tends to do, the high and the low have to do with the amount of cover. So if we have squash compared to, brambles, blackberries or something, that's going to have different cover. That's what high and low means. And specialty crops tend to be your fruits and vegetables. Other agronomic crops include things that are not prevalent in the watershed. For instance, we have cotton in Virginia, but not anywhere else, and it's not a lot of cotton, so that tends to fall under other agronomic crops. And we have hay, pasture. We have leguminous hay, that would be your alfalfa or alfalfa mixes. And then these last two are permitted and non-permitted feeding space. We used to call those AFO and CAFO, or animal feeding operation and concentrated animal feeding operation. And that is classified as having 1,000 animals or more. I know that in Pennsylvania there's a category, and I'm not going to get the name right, but it's not a CAFO, but it is something similar to that, like a CAO. In Maryland, there are MAFOs, which are smaller than CAFOs. But again, we don't have that here. We're just talking about permitted being 1,000 animal units or more, and then non-permitted. Those differentiation comes from the states, by the way. They provide that split for how much feeding space is one or the other. So that's what we have to work with, and then we look at the BMPs, and we could go in here and edit this grass buffer on leguminous hay, or we could do adding a BMP. And I'm going to select, and I could select just one county, and that's fine. Or I could scroll down here and select state basin, in which case it's Maryland Potomac. But I can create my plan for the entire Maryland Potomac and then put my BMP on something smaller within the Maryland Potomac. So I could pick a HUC 12. Let me scroll up to HUC 12. And I can select one of these. I can select, Pretty Boy Reservoir. I tend to stay away from reservoirs unless I have special knowledge about them when you're doing a plan. So if you have local knowledge, that's great. Go with it. If you don't, which I generally don't, then I stay away from them because there's so much trapped by the reservoir that the amount that is delivered out of that reservoir down the stream to the bay tends to be fairly low. So to have the biggest impact, I'm more likely to focus a BMP on a place where the delivery will be higher, like Gunpowder Falls. And then there are going to be a lot of different BMPs for agriculture. Note these cover crops. There's commodity cover crop, plain cover crop, and then a cover crop with fall nutrients, which is allowed under the guidelines in I believe all the states one way or another. Cropland irrigation, we have forest buffers. Oops, I went off of that. There's the land retirement, nutrient management. Nutrient management can be a little tricky because the definitions have changed over the last several years, and people kind of got used to the old ones. You have to have core, and then if you also have additional capacity within nutrient management, you could have rate, placement, or timing. And I think these are pretty good definitions to explain it, and they're different for nitrogen and phosphorus. So you'd have to input these separately, and this is something that an expert panel developed. So we could go ahead and put in place, placement for nitrogen, which might mean we side dress it at a certain time of the growing season. And we can select to put on cropland and hay, and if you do cropland You can see it's on grain, silage, soybeans, and other agronomic, or we could do that including hay. We could do it just on the cropland that has manure. You know, so we have these different categories. And if you're not happy with the categories, let me know and we'll add some more. But generally this covers it for what most people have asked for in the past. So I'm going to put on cropland because that's kind of the biggest. That plus hay, I guess, is the biggest category. And then we can do this as acres or percent. Since there are already so many BMPs, I'm guessing that nutrient management in placement is in here and percent would generate an error. So I'm going to pick acres, and I'm going to put that on 600 acres and click Save. And so that's going to go in. So that's, you know, you've seen a couple of examples of how to add BMPs through this interface, and it's here at the top. And then we have animal BMPs. These are the animal types we have. This is based on the agricultural census and how things are categorized and have been categorized since 1984. So the categories have changed. We've come up with categories that encompass all of those changes. And we have the animals. So this is, you know, we're talking about 6 million pullets or 4 billion broilers. In permitted versus non-permitted. We also have those animal units. So when you're looking at chickens, that's a lot of chickens. But if you're looking at beef, it's not so many cows. So we're talking about 1,000, an animal unit is 1,000 pounds of live animal. I think that's up here in this definition. It is. So that's 1,000 pounds of live animal as an animal unit. So we have both the animal units or animals, however you want to think about that. And you can see that information. So for example, you know, you can see there aren't that many goats. I probably wouldn't want to focus any BMPs on goats. I know poultry is the biggest, so you know, I'm going to want to focus on poultry when I look at my BMPs. So we can filter this, and we can put this on poultry and see what shows up. And it may be that nothing shows up because it's at a specific category. Poultry would include pullets, broilers, layers, and turkeys. So let's go ahead and just put in here broilers. Let me scroll down here so we can get the whole page. Oops, I went back to the whole scenario. Let me go back in there. We were under animal BMPs. And I was trying to filter. So we're going to filter by broilers. And we can see the broiler BMPs we have here, and we've got animal waste management systems. That's always a good one to do. And there are going to be several others in here as well. Well, no, I guess there aren't. I guess it is just animal waste management systems. So let's add some more BMPs to this one. And you can do this in any order. You don't have to select the geographic scale first. It may be that we want to put poultry litter amendments in place. And this would be adding alum to acidify the poultry litter. And that would reduce the amount of volatilization. And then here, if I pick chickens, it tells me it's a category of pullets and broilers. Or I could do poultry, which are all different kinds. And I can put on feeding space, which is both, or just one, feed, you know, permitted or non-permitted. And then the amount. We can do this as percent. And I'm going to say we're going to do poultry litter amendments on 25%. And I'll select my geographic scale. And if I pick state, state is larger than just the Potomac, and that's fine. I can do that, and it'll just distribute that 25% across the entire state, but I'll only see 25% of the Potomac. Now, as a percent, it doesn't really make a difference because, you know, percent is what it is. If it were in units of acres or animals, or something like that, then it would distribute across the entire state, and I would get less than the number I put in that little box for amount. but for percent it just doesn't matter. 9-click Save. Okay, so we've got that in here. That BMP got added, so we've got that in here now. And we're filtering on boilers, so let me remove this filter and so that we can see, well, it's resorted, but we've got this BMP in here now. And then manure transport. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this one because it's the same thing as dry tons of manure. And you can add in manure transport. Let me select the BMP, this manure transport, and if you want to say it's going out from out of the watershed, say the Ohio River Valley, you would say it's from out of the watershed. Otherwise, you could say it's coming from somewhere else. And then you could say where it's going to. Typically, people will want to get rid of all the manure, so they say that the manure is going out of the watershed. Or it could just go to a different county. If it is being transported within a county, then there's no need to put it in here because these calculations for manure transport are done at the county scale. There is also manure treatment technology. In Adams County, Pennsylvania, there's a company called Energy Works. So if you wanted to do some analysis on that, you could pick the different, whatever the appropriate kind of manure treatment technology is. There are 19 options, which is a lot. And then enter that information. And again, you still have to pick county from and county to for that. And then you have dry tons as an option. So that would be the manure transport. So, you know, you've added BMPs, you've made your changes, and we made just a couple of changes as examples. And so those were saved as we went along. We could just verify our scenario metadata were correct or not. We didn't make any, you know, we could take a look at this and not make any changes. We don't need to do anything. And if you just go back to scenarios, then your BMP changes are in there. So the forest buffers that we added, the other BMPs we added are all in there. And then if you forget what to do next, and this has been happening, is people say, well, I added my BMPs, now what? If you go over this scenario status, you can hover and it says last edits complete, continue editing, or click run for results. So you could go back in and edit some more, or you can just click run. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll run it and see if I got load reductions I wanted, and if I didn't, I'll come back and make even more changes. And so you can, once you run it, you can always come back and edit it again. You don't have to just run it and then say, that's done, I can't get back in. It's not locked. You can come back in. So what we're going to do is let that run, and then we're going to compare this to the WIP too, and we can see what the load reductions are. And I want to show you some options for doing these comparisons. And 3 options. One is graphs, one is compare scenarios, and one is reports. And we try to make it convenient for people who are looking at the need to reduce nitrogen, phosphorus, and or sediment loads. You can do it a number of different ways. Sometimes people are given a targeted load to reduce, either an allocation for a TMDL or target or a goal. The terminology varies depending on the kind of plan you're working on, but I'm just going to use the term a target. So if you're given a target as a % reduction, and that is pretty typical for a local TMDL, where you can calculate the % reduction required, then you can see that on the screen with compare scenarios. Sometimes people are told they have to hit a particular load. For instance, it has to be, 11 pounds per acre. You can't go over that, in which case we give you the acres and we give you the pounds. And sometimes people are given a target of reducing a certain number of pounds. So what is the difference? You have to reduce, I don't know, 600 pounds. So that's another option for how you're given targets. So depending on how you're given the target is either a pound you have to hit, a pounds reduced, or a % reduction. All of the information should be here to figure out if you hit that target or not. I like to start with the most general. So what I do is I start with a graph. And we start off by creating a graph, and we can do this for multiple scenarios. I'm going to go ahead and pick, since we did that scenario for the state basin, I'm going to go ahead and pick Maryland, Potomac. And if this list is too long, and it will be for, say, a HUC, remember you've got this search feature. So but I can just double click here, and that should go over for Maryland, Potomac. I can select my agencies, and I'll pick all agencies, but many of you may only be interested in non-federal, in which case you would only pick non-federal. And then I'll select my scenario. And, this is a long list, so I'm going to start with the WIP and say, and I just typed in W, and it went to that part of the list. And then my second scenario that I want is going to be probably here at the bottom, this comparison to WIP 2. And I could pick a third and a fourth scenario to compare it to, but I don't need to. I'm just going to do those two, and I'll click Graph. And we're going to get two more tabs that are going to pop up. The first is Loads, and the next is Sources. These little buttons up here add elements to the bar graph. So now we have 4 elements. We have nitrogen at edge of stream and edge of tide. We have phosphorus at edge of stream and edge of tide. I'm going to unclick the phosphorus, and it rescales that y-axis. So we've got this nitrogen edge of stream for edge of stream. And edge of stream in this version of the model is the edge of a small stream. In the previous version of the model, it was the edge of a river, essentially the edge of a large stream. So we're looking at a small stream in this case. Most people are doing work at a local scale. They're going to want to look at the edge of stream. But if you're given a target for the Bay TMDL, it's probably going to be for edge of tide, in which case you'd want to look at that edge of tide load. Likewise, if you want to see the impact of what you're doing locally on the whole Chesapeake Bay, you could just look at the difference in these two bars, and you can see the impact of what happens in those stream processes. So we can look at the nitrogen change between the WIP2. We added a little bit more BMPs, and we have this additional reduction. Let's unclick these, and we can look at the same thing for phosphorus. So for phosphorus, we have an increase. There are a couple of explanations for that. One is that there's an error in this draft version of the model associated with stream loads, which is when I mentioned that we had 2 stream categories, and we're getting rid of one of those. It's because it was not good data that we were using, and we're going to handle that a different way. But once in a while you can see, and that's what's going on here, and I know that only because I've dealt with these numbers quite a bit. So when the final version comes out in a month or so, then you won't see this kind of effect. But once in a while you can still see it, and it'll be because there's a BMP that will keep the phosphorus on the land. This happens in agriculture. It keeps it from running off, but it could increase it on certain load sources. So, you may have less phosphorus lost to the storage area or that feeding space, but there's more phosphorus applied to the crops because it's available to be spread. So once in a while you'll see something like that. And then on this scale, this graph, we have sediment. And the units up here are important. A lot of times people expect to see sediment in tons. We do show sediment here in pounds, as is nitrogen and phosphorus. So we have edge of stream and edge of tide sediment. The same issue that's going on here with phosphorus increasing is the same one as sediment. So you can see the sediment. Let's just focus on edge of stream for phosphorus and sediment, and we can see that there was an increase, not just between edge of stream, not just between edge of stream and edge of tide, but also between our 2 scenarios. So the BMPs we put in place actually caused an increase in phosphorus. And again, some BMPs will do that when they move the phosphorus from one load source to another. You can print this, and you can print to your printer, or you can print that to a PDF, and you can have these graphs ready to go. So if you get caught having to do a presentation at the last minute, this is kind of handy because in about 10 minutes you can have graphs ready. I know that's happened to me, so I like to have that functionality. I switched from the Loads tab to the Sources tab. This is useful for looking at the the various source sectors. So we've got wastewater, septic, natural, agriculture, and developed. And the key is up here. If you hover over it, it does highlight that on the pie. I don't think that's particularly useful, but it is kind of fun to do. We have the percents shown. If you hover, the pounds will show for how much is in each sector. And again, these scenarios that we're looking at are for the Maryland Potomac. If you were looking at the District of Columbia, there would be no blue, no agriculture, and very little septic. And, so depending on where you are, you're going to see these change quite a bit. Our two scenarios are fairly similar, so you don't see too much change. What we did do is add forest buffers, so there should be an increased load in natural. Because we added, I believe we added forest buffers, so we should see more acres there, which I'm not seeing, but that should be the effect of that. And then we have phosphorus, and you can see the sector breakout, and sediment if I scroll down. So that's your big picture, literally your picture. We also have compare scenarios as a way to look at results. And let's just look at those same two scenarios. I'm going to make these selections, and as I do so, let me pause and have y'all, I'll quit talking so y'all can ask questions. So I'm going to pick the WIP 2, and then the scenario that we did, which was this very last one. And if I wanted to, I could also add in another comparison and say, well, where were we in 2013? And I might do that just for fun. Click Compare Scenarios. So you can use this tool for a single hydrologic unit code. So if you want to do a river, it's not just the waterway. It would be the drainage to that waterway, so the land that drains to it. So if you wanted to do the Muddy Branch, you could pick that Muddy Branch HUC 12 as an example. So we have here 3 additional tabs. This is going to be the annualized costs and the acres. We will also have the loads, that would be the pounds, and then we also calculate percent change. So when we were talking about, I was talking about the different ways you can get a target. It could be a percent change, it could be a load that has to be reduced, or it could be the actual, you have to hit the actual load, or a pound per acre. So this is going to populate, and as it's doing so, I'll just say, on almost all these screens we have these download, and you can download whatever's in the table, or we can go to reports, and I'll show you some reports, and you can download that. These screens also have these little video cameras. That's what it's meant to represent, as a video camera. Most of these are recorded, and there are a couple that are not up yet, but should be recorded in the next week or two. And these are 1 or 2, I think one video is 3 minutes, but they're no longer than 3 minutes. And they will give you an idea of what to do on this page, and I think they're really useful. They're done by my colleague Veronica, and she's really good at this. And you can also go to View Documentation, and that takes you to a longer documentation. There's, it's got a table of contents, but it's documentation for the entire tool, and also provides some explanation.
Hey, Olivia. This is Mariah. I have a question from Eliza in the chat box.
Yeah.
And she said, is there a visual map associated with this tool? Can we see the load sources calculated at the new spatial resolution or a GIS layer?
Yes, Eliza, that's something I went over at the last webinar, and I want to circle back to that. And so I'm going to show you this functionality on compare scenarios. I'll circle back to some of the GIS after that.
Also, Thomas had a, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I saw Thomas's question about the single creek, and that was using the Hawk, so I think
Okay,
I got
great.
that question.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, so I was skipped over to the nitrogen loads, and I want to take a moment to look at these headings. This is the WIP2 that was done, and this is the comparison, the scenario that we created. So you can see this for each sector, and if we expand it, we can look at the details similar to how we did on the BMP pages, and you can compare and see this very detailed for grains with manure that the load increased, and I think that's because we added that animal BMP that put more of the pounds of nitrogen on the crop as opposed to allowing it to volatilize. So that's why that load would have increased. And the AFO, CAFO, or feeding space load would have decreased. So we've got these broken out by sector, but you can also look at the total across the bottom. So again, we're looking at both of these are edge of stream, and these are our two scenarios. Oh, three, because I added 2013 progress in. So in the WIP, it was 18 million. In our scenario, it went up to 19 million. And then the 2013 was higher, which you would expect 2013 to be higher than the WIP, and so that was 20 million. And then we can look at the edge of tide values. If that's what you're interested in, then you could see the similar pattern there. And we've got phosphorus, and we could look at this for the developed sector or the agricultural or any of these individual ones. And you can look at the totals across the bottom, and we're seeing a similar pattern. And then also for sediment. Sometimes people ask us why we don't model other things besides nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, why we don't have toxics in here, why we don't have bacteria in here. And it's because this is really focused on the data that comes from the old Chesapeake Bay program model, and this is what that model is set up to do. If we wanted to create the same kind of tool, we would just need to figure out, how these BMPs impact bacteria or how they impact toxics. And that's possible. It's just not something that's been asked for very broadly. So these are the loads. These are total pounds that are delivered in a year. In the case of the 2013 progress, it was specified as that year, 2013. These other two are plans that were based on 2010, but essentially a WIP is a plan we expect to have achieved in 2025. But it's not what the pounds are from 2017 to 2025 or from 2010 through the 2025 period. So we're not looking at that 15-year period. We're looking at just what the total pounds are delivered in that 1 year. So it uses an average hydrologic period. So it's not assuming a wet year, it's not assuming a dry year, it's an average period that we say would result in these pounds being delivered in that year. So we've got the load comparison, we've got the percent change. The percent change shows you exactly that, the percent change from one to another. And to calculate percent change, you really can't do it for a whole sector, so we have to do it for the individuals. It's kind of a math issue. And we can see that ag open space, we reduced loads. Permitted feeding space, reduced loads for nitrogen, not for phosphorus or sediment. Here we increased loads on silage with manure a little bit. So we can see that information for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. The other results we could see are reports. And I want to come back to this because I want to answer Eliza's question. So let's go and look at some of the GIS information on that home screen. I feel like my internet's slowed down here. Sometimes when I do trainings in like state offices, then I notice it gets pretty slow between 12 and 1. I'm in my own office, so I'm not really sure why it's slowed down, but it obviously has.
Olivia, if it makes you feel any better, Thomas commented in the chat box, and he said, good to know I'm not the only one with internet issues all day.
Yeah, last time I did this webinar, I was in the National Park Service office, and there's was where we had an issue, but we got past that. So this is the home page again, and I am still logged in, but if I scroll down here under additional resources, there's this BMP's models and geography. So when you're looking for GIS, I'm hoping that this word geography clues you in that this is where you should go. If you click on Learn More, then you can see that there's some map tools up here, and then there's some shapefiles here. And then it did say BMP's models and geography. So here's some detailed BMP information and detailed cost information, and then the ATMDL information, including the actual WIPs. These are the Phase 2 WIPs. So let's start up here at the map tools. We have this compare public scenarios, and the public scenarios are those like the progress, and there are two ways to get to this functionality, and one is when you're not logged in, there's a public reports page you can drop down and get this to. If you are logged in, you can come here, and it opens this, this tool. And it has here the various scenarios, so you can look at all of them. They're for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. That's why this list is so long. And they also are for edge of stream and edge of tide. So it may be that you want to say, well, if I do something in one location, how much of that gets delivered to the bay? Or it may be that you want to compare scenarios like we were just doing. Now, this won't have any scenarios you create. It will just have those public scenarios. But we can compare the Phase 2 WIP, nitrogen, edge of tide. And then here I can compare this Phase 2 WIP. I could do edge of stream, or maybe what I'll do is the E3 nitrogen, edge of tide. And we've got this map. And you can use this to focus in on something, or you can simply scroll to zoom in. And I think there's some information up here too that describes the information on the page that you've picked. And I'm in Lancaster County, and you can see that not all of Lancaster is created equal. There's this area here where the loading is not quite as high in the WIP, and then where the E3, the load has been reduced quite a bit. So as I scroll just on one of these maps, they both follow that same resolution. So this is just a way to view the data. This is not a GIS file, so this isn't directly answering Eliza's question, but I wanted to kind of show you that. We also have the model scenario viewer. I just want to go through all of these so you know it's available. And on this model scenario viewer, there's always a splash that comes up. And the secret of this is that nothing shows up and you think it's not working, and then you have to click on the layer list and select something, which the designers thought was obvious, but it wasn't obvious to me, so I always point it out. We have on here the loads, and we could see the loads in here from public scenarios, and this is the same set of scenarios we've been looking at. We can see that here. You can also look at some land use details. These are the categories that we have in this mapping tool. You've got modeling layers. These are kind of useful because you can get in here the National Hydrography, I'm not sure what the right word is there, data set from USGS that is also used in the Sparrow model, and you could see those, which are much smaller segments. You can see the actual federal facilities. And you can also see this cross-GIT restoration and conservation layers. GIT stands for Goal Implementation Team. It's part of the Chesapeake Bay Program governance structure. There are PCB impairments in here, so if we do that, we will see the PCB impairments come up, and I'm going to zoom in. I was doing this recently in Washington, D.C. And all of Washington is PCB impaired except for this little portion, which is where the Arboretum is, and that's been the Arboretum for a long, long time. But you can see, where you might want to target. There's also, I know black duck is in here, and it may be under conservation layers. I think it is under conservation layers. I'll turn that off. So we could look at black duck habitat, not in D.C. That's going to be, here along a little further south and along the waterways. We could look at brook trout presence. So here we've got brook trout that's mapped. I'm not sure. I think there's more information here. The description is there. There's also some tools over here to add data, and I'm going to leave it to people like Eliza who are far more GIS savvy than I could ever be on what's available in this tool. But I think if you click around, you'll see that you can add some other information, including a file if you wanted to add a JSON file. So I know that some people have been using that, and it's been working quite well for them. But there's a lot of information here. You can change your base map. So if you wanted to see, the imagery, you could do that. So there are several options in here. So that was the model scenario of the viewer. There's the USGS non-tidal monitoring stations, and this is useful to see what the monitored data is. Everything in CAST is modeled. Obviously, you can't model something that's not in place. So when we're using CAST, we're asking those what-if questions. What if I did more forest buffers? What if I did lagoon covers for dairy farms? Or what if I did something else? But if you want to look at monitoring data, then you can click on that link, and it takes you here. If you click on the map comes up, and you can look at trends, loads, and yields. So whenever you change that, it shows up over here with what the definition is. And you can change it to nitrate, phosphorus, or sediment. They've got, or dissolved inorganic phosphorus. They've got the options up there. And you can scroll in and look at specific places here. So there's no trend here. This is degrading, increasing load. I'm not positive. I think I'm kind of over, well, it's not in Lancaster County or Maryland, but over here you've got Lancaster. I think I'm in Lancaster County, and you can see that for most of this area the trend is going down, which is good news. So that's a trend. We also have just the actual loads, and people do get confused about it. The trend is a period of time. The load is what it is in an annual, in 1 year. And then we have yields, and that normalizes it to the amount of stream flow. So if you want to compare across area, it may be that this stream delivers a lot more than this stream. And if you want to control for the yields and control for the rainfall, then you would do it this way. And looking at what's being delivered. I guess this is the Susquehanna, you were saying Susquehanna, and what's delivered to the Conowingo, to the Bay. So this is looking at monitored data. This is USGS data. The model that CAST uses is calibrated to all of these monitoring stations. So that's some map tools. We also have measure polygon area. This is kind of a cute little thing that somebody asked for and was easy to develop, and it literally just measures the area. People have been using it to measure the area of a farm field. I'm not sure what the other application is, but you zoom way in and find a farm field. You could just measure that by clicking on the points. So I think you have to, let's see, draw area, and you would just click and say, what is this particular farm field. And it tells you that it's the area and the perimeter. So kind of fun, but I'm not real sure what the use is, except there was a particular use a couple of years ago, so we developed it. Shape files, we have them in GIS, and if you don't have a GIS program, that's okay. They're also in KMZs, and anybody could download Google Earth for free and use the files that way. So we have the segmentation, that's the modeling segment. We have combined sewer overflows, so you can see those areas. They were also on the model scenario viewer, so you could view it that way, but if you wanted to download the file and do your own analysis with it, you can do that. MS4s, federal lands, the Maryland regulated area. Maryland does a lot of their own mapping, and then we incorporate their areas. That's done by Jeff White at MDE. He does a fantastic job. So that's the Maryland file separate. And then direct loads, which includes wastewater, rapid infiltration basins, large monitored septic systems, and the spray irrigation that is applied to developed lands. Agricultural land spray irrigation is included elsewhere, but not in this file. So that's some of the GIS tools we have available. I want to go back to results and look at reports. Before I jump off of this page, does anybody have any questions about the GIS data? Okay, and the way I got there was from the home page, and it was this BMP's models and geography. So I want to go back to results, and I'm still logged in so I can get to all of the detailed reports. When you're not logged in, you can still get reports for those public scenarios, but you don't have as many options as when you do log in. There are a lot of different report types. Let me just kind of talk about each of these, and there are pop-ups that describe them. The first one is a BMP summary report, and it's first because this is kind of what a lot of people want to see, is just a summary of the BMPs. It lumps together all of the cover crops. It lumps together most of the developed stormwater control practices, and you can download that information, and it tells you what it is in terms of, say, acres, as well as in terms of percent implementation. And that percent implementation gives you a quick glance at, you know, how well a geographic area is doing. Are they at 30% implementation or 60% implementation? If you're doing some detailed analysis, you may want to download this BMP submitted versus credited report. It'll have all of the detailed information for what was submitted, and if you submitted 3 million acres and there are not 3 million acres, then it will tell you that it credited only, you know, 200 acres or however many could be credited. So it's kind of a nice check. It also has the cost information in this report. You can look at the base conditions. The base conditions would include the land use before and after the BMPs are credited, as well as the septic systems and the animal numbers. Most people are looking for the loads report, so we're going to download this one and I'll come back to it. But let me finish talking about the others. We have the wastewater report. That gives you all the wastewater data. So if you wanted to see if maybe the E3 scenario, if you want to ask the question, well, does E3 assume that all facilities, you know, reduce to, I don't know, 2 milligrams per acre or gallons per day, whatever it's measured in, then you could download that report and take a look and figure that out. We also have atmospheric deposition. There is nitrogen and phosphorus that's deposited both wet and dry, and that's in this report. And then we have quick results report. For people who are used to using the old version of CAST, this is giving them similar results to what they're used to, where it puts it all in one place. And it's quick in the sense that you don't have to put too many selections in, and you get a lot of information in one report. But it is a little bit less detailed than if you pick the other reports. And then the BMP input files. I had mentioned that you can upload files. So if I wanted to take all the BMPs in my scenario and, say, increase them by 10%, then I would want to download the BMP input files here. And this will come down in a spreadsheet. I can open it. I can multiply all the implementation by 1.1, which is a 10% increase, and save that and upload it. when I'm adding a scenario, and that's a quick and easy way to do it as opposed to clicking on that blue Add BMP button. So this is a useful because it just puts everything in the right format for uploading files. Let's go back to the loads report. This is going to be the example loads, and this was for Maryland. And select my geographic scale. I'm going to pick this state basin area in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and I want to do the Maryland Potomac. I'm just showing you once again how you can filter. You can see that there are 5 basins in Maryland. We did the Potomac, and I can double click to move it over. If I wanted to do all of Maryland, I could pick state. Up here is an option just to do the whole state right here, and I could pick that, but it wouldn't break it out by state basin. So if I wanted all of Maryland broken out by state basin, I would need to pick Maryland as I would need to pick state basin and then select all of the Maryland state basins and move them all over. So that would be the way to get the entire state broken out by state basin. Or if you wanted the entire state broken out by HUC 8, then you would pick HUC 8 and then pick all of that state's HUC 8s as an example. And again, going back to Thomas's question, if you're looking for just one small watershed, then you would pick HUC, probably a HUC. I keep coming back to HUC 12 because it's the smallest size, but you could pick the HUC 12, and if I unfilter here, then that list would show up. And you can see the different HUC 12s, and I could just pick Occoquan Creek or you know, whatever's relevant to you in here. And I don't know if there's a HUC that is just for the Severn, but you know, you could type that filter in there and see if it, well, not if you spell it wrong, Severn Run. So you could just pick Severn Run right here. But let me go back and pick the state basin, and we'll stick with the Maryland Potomac. And then there's a way to filter here. So there are public scenarios, those that were shared with me in my scenarios. I generally like to have a shorter list because I have trouble spotting things on these long lists. We want to do the scenarios, the public one, which was the WIP, the WIP 2, and we want to do the one that I created, which is my scenario. And so I pick those 2. I could add other ones in here. You can add lots of scenarios in here. And then the aggregations. This is a little confusing, and so I want to take a minute to kind of talk about it, and I'd also welcome your suggestions if you have ideas for how to make it less confusing. We have here kind of 2 components, the source, that load source, that would be like grains with manure, or it could be, you know, roads or tree canopy over pervious, something like that. And then we have agency, and the agency would be the Smithsonian or Agricultural Research Service or Department of Defense or non-federal. So we have here major source as this category, and major source is something like regulated versus non-regulated, and it doesn't break it out into those details. Minor source breaks it out into the very specific, into more specific, but it's still a grouping. So minor source in agriculture would be all the crops or all the pasture, but it doesn't break it out into soybeans versus grains versus double cropping. It would just say crop. And then we have source, and if it says source, it has the individual sources. So it would have soybeans, it would have double cropped, it would have grains with manure, grains without manure, and so forth. And so that's how the sources work. We also have all the sources together. This would include ag and urban and natural, so your forest and your crops and your developed lands are all mixed together, and that just gives you that one row for source. So that's how the source works. The agency, if it says all, it's going to group them all together. So it doesn't matter whether it's DOD or non-federal. Those are all grouped together, and there's no differentiation. And then we have federal versus non-federal. So in Maryland, it's 3 non-federal. It would be state, State Highway Administration and non-federal versus all the federal ones. And then we have agency, which is all the detailed. So if you pick source agency, that gives you the most detail. If you pick all sources, all agencies, that is the most aggregated. You will get one row in your report. So I'm gonna show you that so you can see. Well, I didn't mean all sources agency. I meant source agency. So I'm gonna X this one out because I didn't mean to pick that, and click Submit Report. And you'll get a little box saying that the report was submitted, and some of these take a long time to run and some run almost instantly, and then it should show up in your email when it's ready. It also, you will get an email, and you could click on the link in that email to download the report. You can also go to this other tab where it says Download Report, and you can see that it's complete, and it's already here. You can go through here and delete them if you want. If you forget what your selections were, it's okay. You can come back and say what you selected. Obviously, I would just remember that one, but here's one I did a long time ago, and I don't remember what I selected, but I can click on that, and it will pop up. Let's download it, and I'll open it for you. So here's the report that opened. There's a README that tells you what kind of report it is, scenario details, and so it tells me which scenarios I picked and reminds me of my base conditions. And this is helpful because if I go to compare these two and I realize that, oops, I picked the different year, then I'm not just comparing the difference in BMPs, I'm also comparing the difference in the acres of that load source. So it's good to take a look at that and verify. Here's the most aggregated report, all sources, all agencies. So you get one row, and that is useful for some situations. Other times you want this detail. This is a lot of detail, and I like to filter my data most of the time, so I just highlighted everything and click on Data and Filter. And we'll take a look at this. It comes out with today's date, and you get the geography. So all of ours are going to be Maryland, Potomac. If I had done my other example where I picked state basin and I picked all of Maryland's state basins, then we would have all of those listed here. It tells me what's in each sector, and it tells me each load source. So within agriculture, we've got all these load sources. It tells you if it's a load allocation or a waste load allocation, which is important to people working on the TMDL. And then it tells you the agency. So there are a dozen agencies in here. Well, about a dozen, it's not quite. And for each load source. So, since most of these federal ones are not going to have, will not have ag acres by definition, they're not going to show up as having acres. But you can see that for non-federal, there are acres for this agricultural one. If we were looking at the developed sector, then we would see acres for more of these options here. This is CSS, so let me go ahead and pick some non-CSS. I will do the MS4 ones. So you can see that we've got more acres here for all these agencies. I'm going to scroll over a little bit. Sometimes what I like to do is to put in place split so that I can keep this other information, and I just click split up here under view, and then when I scroll over, I'm just scrolling over that part of the page, and I don't have to look at this part each time. And I also don't lose this other information. So this column is called unit. Most of these are at acres. There will be some that are measured in feet or miles or for septic systems. And then this amount here for our two scenarios refers to this unit here. Sometimes people want to sum all of this up, and that's fine. Just make sure you realize that you're summing what could be a combination of acres and miles and systems, and that would be illogical. So just double check that unit when you start summing. So this is the amount. And then the next couple of columns over, we have the nitrogen load edge of stream, phosphorus load edge of stream for our two scenarios, and they're side by side, sediment load edge of stream, and then we also have it by edge of tide for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. So depending on what you're interested in, it's all here. A lot of times what I do when I'm doing analysis is I will come and take this nitrogen load edge of stream and I will insert a column, and I want to figure out what my pounds per acre is. And I'm going to do it for this scenario. Just compare, I'm going to do it for, this scenario is the one I want to do. And in which case, I mean, this is just very simple, but just to give you an idea of how you can do this, this is the pounds, and I'm going to divide by the amount, and that gives me the nitrogen pounds per acre, and that's a nice way to compare regardless of the acres. So you can see that most of these are loading somewhere between 12 and sometimes it gets up to like 20 pounds per acre, depending on the load source. But anyway, that's a way to do some analysis here that makes it more comparison when the land use areas change. So that's downloading the loads report. And again, we saw that information through the graphs. We saw it on the screen through compare scenarios, and now we downloaded a report. Let me show you a BMP credited scenario that I did some time back, just so you can see what this report looks like. And these columns are defined because some of them you start looking at and you wonder what that means, and it's defined on this README page. Again, scenario details. I can't remember what I was working on, but I put something in there. And then it's divided into land, animal, and manure because our BMPs have different columns depending on whether they're land, animal, or manure. So I've got the scenario name, the geography, and I have the agencies here. I believe I probably selected just non-federal, and then the BMPs. And so we've got impervious surface reduction as one of these first ones. That was pretty popular in the last version of the WIP, which is interesting because it's a pretty expensive BMP, and I don't actually think people do that much of it. They certainly haven't been reporting it. But it is a land use change. It changes it from impervious to pervious, and it was on all of these load sources, so it changed it from these to these other ones. So roads went to turf grass, for example. We have, it's measured in acres. We have the amount submitted, and then there's some back out depending on the land cover data. And then there's the amount credited. Take a look at this column called excess because sometimes, if I submitted, accidentally typed in 3 million, then the excess would show up. And you can see here that there's somewhere, the amount submitted was greater than the amount available. I'm just going to pick on this one and see what it is. So if I submitted 3 million, that may not have all been able to be credited. So this is stream, bed, and bank. So somebody submitted, or in this scenario, urban stream restoration, and there were not enough feet of stream to implement the amount that was submitted. So this was a pretty big number here. 12 million feet of stream, bed, and bank of stream restoration were submitted. It could not all be credited, and so this tells you the amount that was not credited, and this tells you the amount that was credited in the end, and it was 6 million feet for whatever geography this was. And then you can see this last column has the cost in it, the total annualized cost. And I'm just going through here as I pick this out, and I'm putting in the way I like to see numbers. So that's dollar signs. I like to see that. You can do that or not, whatever you're comfortable with. And that's pretty expensive here. But I do know that stream, bed, and bank that stream restoration reduces a lot of load, so it may be worth the cost. So we are at 2:45. I believe this is scheduled to go to 3. I showed you this page for land. We've got it for animal, but in that case we would have animal name. And for manure, we have where it's coming from and where it's going to. It's all done by county. So we've got that information in our BMP report, and we looked at our loads report, and I think those are the main ones you would want to look at. Let me pause and see what questions you have. I don't see any in the chat box. Do y'all have a, just kind of a general question, do y'all have a good idea how you're planning to use the tool, or are you more interested in kind of what opportunities exist once you know more about the tool? Does anybody think they're going to need to do some analysis using the cost data? If so, I can turn to looking at the cost profiles now.
This is Eliza. I would like to know a little bit about those cost profiles. Yes, I work a lot with our local Department of Environmental Protection here in Montgomery County, and would love to be able to work with them side by side on some of that information.
Okay, so let me turn to the cost information and show you how that works. And these videos have not yet been recorded. We just put together the text for what will be said, so they should be up, and you know, and it takes about 3 weeks to get them all recorded and cleaned up and put up. But so these aren't there yet, but they're coming. I have here the public cost profiles, and these were developed by contractors to EPA from publicly available information. So there's a report that was done by King and Hagen that a lot of people in Maryland are familiar with, and that was used as a source, as well as other information that's available, publicly available. For the ag costs, a lot of it's from the NRCS directly. So you can download this information, take a look at it. You can also edit this information. In Montgomery County in particular, you'd be looking at a mix of redevelopment and new development. What we've done with these costs is averaged the two together. So we're assuming 50% redevelopment and 50% new development. It is unlikely it would ever be that split. So you'd probably want to do some editing of the costs. When you do that, you want to add a new cost profile, and we can just call this Montgomery County, and we can make this redevelopment, and type in a description, and we would select the Maryland default as a starting point. And I don't really want to share, so I'm just going to click Create. And so now I have this Montgomery County redevelopment, and I'm going to want to go in here and edit this cost profile. So we get this information that we just entered, and I could decide to share at any time. And then let's look at these developed BMPs. And I'm not going to go through the others because they're similar, but in terms of the processing. But we've got the BMP information here for what all these BMPs are. We have the lifespan. The lifespan is the number of years we expect that BMP to persist given proper operations and maintenance. This is not a model credit duration date or anything like that. It is just really how long we expect it to last. There is a capital cost, and it is like, you know, the equipment that would be needed to implement this BMP, and design and engineering costs. We have operations and maintenance. That's pretty self-explanatory. And then opportunity, which makes perfect sense to economists, and no one else knows really what this is. So you have to think back on any economics courses you took. And it is the represents the land rental cost. So if you're going to put in place, you know, some sort of, let's say you've gotten a big flood like has happened in Houston, then FEMA is going to go and buy back some of those properties, and that means that the opportunity cost is the cost of that land no longer being developed in that case. So the land, many of these are zero, but some of these are going to be the cost, the rental cost for that land. So a bioretention rain garden is going on land, and once it goes down on that land, you can't use it for building a building or renting out property or anything like that. So that's the opportunity cost. What you can do is go in here and make changes, and I'm going to apologize because I don't really have any idea what the correct cost is, so I'm just going to make up numbers, and they may be unreasonable, so my apologies on that. And we could just say if this is if this is redevelopment, it's going to be more expensive than new development, so I'm just going to increase all these costs. And it may be that O&M wouldn't change, but some of this may change, and opportunity probably wouldn't. So I'm going to make those two changes right here. And I may disagree with this lifespan. I may say we've got such great engineers, we can make it last 8 years. So I've made these changes, and then if I click Save, you have to click Save, then this total annualized cost changes, and I've made that change. There's some information on how it's calculated, and you can click on the documentation and see that. But what shows up is the total annualized cost, and this is measured in acres, so it's $11.39 per acre. And so you just multiply that by the number of acres, and that's what comes out of your reports. But you're probably going to want to go in here and be specific. If we're looking at Maryland, we're thinking everything from Garrett County, which is in the mountains, pretty rural, to Maryland's eastern shore or southern Maryland, and things are going to cost different there than they would in Montgomery County. So it's a state average, and it was from the best available data at the time, but you're going to have better, more specific information. So I encourage you to use this as a starting point and not as something that's definitive that you have to live with. If you have no other data, I think it's pretty good, but I'm guessing that a lot of people have more specific information. This is a good opportunity for me to show you the documentation, which I neglected to click on so far. And if I click on it, it brings up the cost profile information, and it tells you kind of what I just did, how to click through and create all of this. It also has some detailed information that may be worth reading about where these costs are, how these costs are calculated, the formulas here, with a definition of the factors in that formula. And it tells you that they're in 2010 dollars. So if you want to look at these in 2017 dollars, you have to look at the inflation rate. So there's some detailed information depending on how much you really want to know. Whenever you click on that view documentation within the tool, it comes up on whatever page you happen to be on. So there's a page for scenarios, and that would come up. You can also get to it through the how-to. There's user documentation, and it takes you to the same thing, but just at the very beginning. I encourage you to look at the when you do this and you get results that you may not expect, it's useful to look at this results page. And my internet's gotten slow again. And you can see that there's a section in here I wanted you to pay attention to on explaining results, and I think that will be helpful to you. But it's under this results tab. And understanding results, that's what it is.
Hey, Olivia, we have
yeah.
We have about 5 minutes left, and it looks like Tom had a few different questions. So, Tom, did you want to go ahead? I know that you had a few thoughts for Olivia that you were wondering. I don't know if he's only on the chat line, but
okay. Tom, I see that you're asking about what more needs to be done. So you can see what is done, and you can increase those BMPs or add new BMPs that are not already in there. And you can start by, just looking at a scenario, or you can download a BMP report for a particular scenario and identify what needs to be done. In terms of seeing the entire potential, on the home page, there is this source data that lists all of this information, and I downloaded it earlier, and I'm just going to pull this up. And it has in this file a list of all the BMPs and the definitions. So you could see some options that maybe aren't being done. I see this particularly in Pennsylvania, where there's a tendency to implement the same BMPs that were previously implemented, but just doing more of them. And a lot of times you'll find it's more effective to maybe, kind of expand here and think about maybe other BMPs that haven't been considered in the past. So this is a list of all of the BMPs that are available. The other question you had was data about living shorelines. We don't have a BMP called living shorelines. We do have shoreline erosion control, of which living shorelines is one of them. So if you wanted to look at the cost for shoreline erosion control, you can certainly do that under cost profiles. There is more detailed data available under optimization and also under the BMP geography tab that has some detailed information that's not in the calculating part of the tool. So the BMP credits for living shorelines is no different than that for installing riprap. It is just kind of an average shoreline erosion control reduction.
Tom, excuse me, Tom, did that answer all of your questions for you? I know we have just a couple minutes left.
I see you disagree, but and I can't control that. I can only tell you what the information is. But so I apologize for that. But yeah, I agree. It's not right. It should be separated, but it's just not what the expert panel decided.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions for Olivia today?
So take a look at this developed information for living shorelines, or resource for, I'm sorry, should be resource for living shorelines, and see if there's more information. And then you can also look at these expert panel reports for living shorelines, and you can see the discussions. I think they pretty much have minutes from all of the meetings, so you can see the report itself, the references, and even the discussion. And I would think that would have been something that was discussed. So you can kind of get the history there before you start making the case.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Olivia, for joining us today. Kristen had to hop off earlier. This is Mariah. So thanks again to everyone who was able to be on the webinar. And I have it recorded, so we'll save it and we'll upload it to the website. And you guys can use your member login, and you can see it there. So again, thanks for joining us.
Okay, and we also have recorded webinars here, and if you wanted, I could add this webinar to it, unless it's something you want to keep confidential, but I can certainly add it to this page on the site.
Great.
And I need to add some more webinars on here, but there's one on targeting, so when you get into the analytical part, you might want to see that one, because I pretty much went over these two today.
Great. And if anyone has any other questions that they weren't able to maybe ask on the webinar, just feel free to reach out to Olivia. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thanks,
Bye,
Mariah.
guys. Thank you so much. No problem.
Bye.